Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and if you're listening to us on one of the many fine podcast platforms at which you can find the Lunch Hour, you can always watch us here in the studio, see what's going on, check us out on our YouTube channel. And if you are watching us on YouTube, you can also take the Lunch Hour with you on those many fine podcast platforms at which you might find us. Please subscribe, leave us a like, leave us a comment, and most importantly, let everybody know, your friends, your family members' friends, your friends' family members, all about the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Joining me today, very excited as I always am to bring our guests on. This is an old friend of mine, I'm a friend of the family, to his family. His name is Jim Pinkerton. He's a veteran of 2 White Houses, 3 presidential transitions, Newsday, I'm not sure why that's in there, presidential campaigns. He worked at Fox News as a contributor for nearly 20 years, as a columnist for Newsday for 15 years, and has published widely from the New York Times to Foreign Affairs, from National Review to The American Conservative. He's got a brand new book out. We're going to talk about that. Jim, let's start here with the book. Tell us about the book.
Well, the book is called The Secret of Directional Investing, Making Money Amidst the Red-Blue Rumble.
Got it. And so I haven't thought of you for whatever reason as someone who is giving investment advice, but talk about this. Talk about how the book came about.
Well, the book came out as I got to thinking, that these trends that we're seeing, if you could have foreseen, for example, that Walt Disney was going to walk into a brick wall on wokeness, and the stock would fall 40% in the last 3 years.
Yeah.
Again, you can make money when the stock goes up. That's the obvious.
Sure.
thing. You can also make money when the stock goes down.
Okay.
It's called shorting the stock.
Sure.
And so if you see a trend like that, if you see Disney is just having trouble with, for example, the Star Wars franchise,
yeah,
you can anticipate the stocks can go down, and that's a trend to be watched. And again, the book actually distinguishes, starting with the investment wisdom, the trend is your friend.
There you go. Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
And so the trend is your friend. So there's trends can then be put into 2 categories. The trend you can spot, which is the passive act of just observing something happening. Red-blue split is a good example. The trouble that Target and Bud Light and BlackRock have been having lately is a trend to be spotted. There are also trends to be shaped.
Yeah.
And that's harder and more ambitious, and it takes a larger effort. But when it works, for example, how Nevada turned itself from a state of tumbleweeds in 1931 into a state of, mega entertainment. And today, they did it by legalizing gambling.
It's funny you said that. I remember a situation when I was working as a small business lobbyist, and we had a delegation come in from, I'm not going to name the town, but a small town in one of the Dakotas. I want to say South Dakota. It may have been North Dakota. And they were trying to find ideas for how to attract and retain people to stay in the Dakotas. And I quipped, because I was being a jerk, get people to move, call it something other than the Dakotas, and maybe you might get people going there. But the reality is that the Dakotas certainly took that step and started investing in the Bakken Shale, the shale oil fields, and turned those states around. This is part of what you're talking about.
Exactly. The states are, as Justice Brandeis wrote back in 1932, the laboratories of democracy.
Sure.
And the quote, this opinion that he wrote back then is so ringing. He said, if we are Americans, we must let our minds be bold.
Sure.
Well, it's a great thought for any American, certainly a great thought for investors. And so South Dakota, has no income tax and has managed to attract a good chunk of the credit card industry.
Yeah.
North Dakota has got the shale oil thing going. Other states that have done interesting things on their own, Delaware and corporate incorporation, Wyoming and bank secrecy. And one of the chapters in the book says, listen, this red-blue rumble thing is so serious now and so polarizing, and you see, Governor Abbott clearly defying the Biden administration on the barbed wire issue. Eagle Pass, Texas. And just today I see Governor DeSantis of Florida saying that he's not going to abide by the Biden administration's Title IX education stuff on transgender. So you start to think, well, what else do the feds do that is such an obvious wet blanket? And the one that leaps to mind, it's a whole chapter in the book, is the Food and Drug Administration.
Right. We'll talk about that.
Well, the Food and Drug Administration has been a damper on medical innovation for a long time. You know, back in 1962, they changed the rules from safety, which is the obvious thing to test for and easy to test for, you can test that, to efficacy.
Sure.
Efficacy is, does the drug work or not? And again, if personalized and individualized medicine means anything, it means that a drug might work for you but not for me, or vice versa. So, you know, the efficacy change in the law led to a no-kidding 90% fall in drug approvals.
Wow.
From the 50s to the 60s. And it's never really recovered since.
And now they want to add the precautionary principle to the whole thing.
Everything, and they've added endless numbers of sidebars and opinions and regulatory opinions and so on. They're way beyond anything that the Constitution or Congress imagined. And so I've said, listen, if Governor Abbott can take on the federal government on the border, what would stop a governor from saying, I think in the given emergency of COVID or Alzheimer's or cancer, there ought not to be an FDA.
Yeah.
In my state.
Sure.
If you love your FDA here in Maryland or New York or California, you can keep it. But if you want to try something new and you've got stage 4 colorectal cancer or pancreatic cancer, you're not getting treated anywhere else, come to South Dakota or Idaho or some red state or just some free state and say, look, here we're going to try something new, and it's at your own risk.
No, go ahead. I'm just.
And so imagine the same kind of economic boom that happened in Nevada
because
on medicine.
See, and it's an interesting thought, right? Because in the end, where we talk about the Commerce Clause, and the Commerce Clause really is about making sure that if something is available in one state, you know, it should be available elsewhere. It sort of lays out what the federal government ought to do. But you really are talking about a competitive advantage here that is done in other areas. Why can't it be done here?
This exactly. And so it would take an enormous effort. But it would be, look, the national health expenditure of the United States is $5 trillion.
Right.
$5 trillion with a T. And that the rest of the world, too, is on top of that. So if you had some, as you say, competitive advantage in your state and say, listen, over there they are buried under FDA regulations and rules. Here, at your own risk, you know, sign a form. We're going to give it a try.
It gets to the issue for things like telemedicine, right? The idea that, you know, and I don't know, I know now that under federal rules, if you are in, let's say, Virginia, and your patient you discover is in Maryland, you can't treat them that way. It seems to me that Maryland should be able to say, you know something, if your doctor is in Virginia and is treating you via telemedicine, we're going to allow that.
It would seem obvious. And since you mentioned the fusion of medicine and tech, you can add another dimension to this, which is AI.
Yeah.
And AI will permit somebody to test 1 million molecules of chemical a second. Every nanosecond. And at that point, the notion of an FDA clinical trial that takes 5 years just is crazy.
Sure.
We're busy cranking out algorithms every nanosecond now, and you want us to wait 5 years to get to treatment. So and there's, in the same way that red states are looking at the federal government under Biden and saying we don't trust these SOBs, blue states, if Trump, when Trump was president, if Trump is president, or the next Republican, whoever it might be, the blue states are just as horrified at the thought of a FDA controlled by the religious right and banning the abortion pill and stuff. So everybody now has an interest in getting away from the one-size-fits-all model.
Does that make the divide worse? Let's talk about this. Let's talk about how we got here. You're someone who's been involved in the political side of things and how how policy intersects with that for a very long time. How did we get here to where we are so divided? I have a theory about this we'll get to in a minute.
Well, I mean, one theory, it might not be as good as yours, but it's from a fellow named Bill Bishop, who wrote a book in 2008 called The Big Sword. I quote him a lot in my book. And he says, as the country became more affluent, people began to say, and sort of moving up the Maslowian hierarchy
Sure.
to self-actualization, my true bliss comes from moving to a state that is ideologically closer to me.
Interesting.
Whether it's liberal or conservative, again, it's both ways, and so people are sorting themselves, and and this is the Bishop argument. And I think there's a lot to that, and then you can combine the usual suspects of the social media and
Sure.
cable TV and everything like that. So the bad news is, I wrote this for Western Journal the other day. Polarization is bad in terms of the political divide. Red and blue are genuinely at hostility to each other. However, the red and blue separation, what I call sort of, the allows for creativity and innovation. And that's kind of, there's a phrase, and it's in the book called, in anthropology, called schismogenesis. Which
Interesting.
Is schism, we all know, about Genesis, we all know. So put them together, and you get a concept of, since we are apart, since we are now rival teams, we both want to improve ourselves to fight better, to struggle better, and that becomes the basis of a kind of a sort of a blue state patriotism and a red state patriotism in competition with it. And so, but there's still then the opportunity for deals. A good example is what's going to happen with AI. AI is going to be a multi-trillion, quadrillion dollar business in the road. It is enormously energy consumptive.
Yes.
I have a piece coming out for Senator Square, and I make the point that a query to ChatGPT consumes 60 times as much energy as a Google search.
Wow.
60 times.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's all me, by the way. That's all that I'm doing. Sorry, go ahead.
And so the thing is, you can't envision any future for AI that is not enormously energy hungry.
Sure.
And you're not going to get there, as the Germans are proving, with solar and windmills.
Right.
So you're going to need nuclear, and you're probably also going to need carbon fuels. I mean, carbon fuels have been running at about 80% of American energy consumption pretty steadily for the last half century.
Sure.
It's actually gone up a little bit under President Biden.
Yeah.
So they're not going
It's ironic.
And so the challenge is AI should realize we'll never get all the visions and dreams that people like Sam Altman of OpenAI have unless we can provide the juice for it.
Sure.
And that means carbon, and then you can say, okay, well, carbon capture. So carbon capture becomes the bridge between blue AI and red energy production. And that becomes then, listen, we may not agree on things like abortion or guns or whatever, but we both agree on making money and getting rich.
But let me come back to this issue of red patriotism versus blue patriotism, because I just saw this movie Civil War, and I had to see it because I don't think you can talk about a movie or something like this unless you have actually seen it. And one of the things that bothered me about it was, now I have a lot of thesis about the issue of how we came to these divisions in and of ourselves, but I think you're right in that there is this red state versus, or red team versus blue team patriotism that ultimately wants to seek the best and would keep us away from the actual kind of insurrection that they talk about in this movie. Talk a little bit about this.
I think that's right. I think that we have all the elements of the Civil War except one, the movie notwithstanding, the actual desire to fight.
Right.
And I was born in Massachusetts, and there's a big memorial on the Boston Common for Arthur Gould Shaw, who was the soldier who fought in the Civil War in the movie Glory.
Played by Matthew Broderick in the movie Glory,
exactly.
yes.
And ask yourself today, would the students at Harvard join in combat and most of them get killed for the sake of keeping South Carolina in the Union?
Yeah.
I think right today they'd say, look, good riddance.
Yeah, right.
So in other words, if there's difference and not a desire to kill each other, then you can say what, quoting Montesquieu, who said 300 years ago, the great thing about capitalism, he called it sweet commerce.
Right.
We don't have, the reason we invented money was to take the value judgment out of you and I transacting with each other. It's just, look, it's just a neutral thing. There's a dollar bill here in front of us, and it goes to you or it goes to me. And now there's not a moral thing about this at all. It's just money. It's just money. And that makes it easy to envision a deal between, Marjorie Taylor Greene and AOC.
Sure. I mean, it does make sense in that regard. Let me get back to something, that I've known about you for some time. You've touted yourself as a so-called big government libertarian. Right. Talk about what that means.
Well, the big government part is mostly national defense.
Yeah.
You just every 50 years or so, you end up in a struggle, a mortal struggle for your existence, whether it's against the British or the Germans or the Russians or the
Chinese
So you need to stay Again, this is one reason why I want red and blue to achieve some degree of autonomy and independence, but not secession, not anything. It just simply says, look, we both have to contribute to the 82nd Airborne and Strategic Air Command and the next cyber thing and stuff. And within that, though, as Nevada proves, as the tech industry proves, freedom is an economic bazooka.
Yeah.
And if you let people loose, they will astound you. And the difference between tech and medical innovation is that medical innovation has the FDA sitting on it. There's no tech. There's no equivalent for that for tech.
Yeah, until we get to the FTC and Lena Khan has her way. Yeah,
they would love to do that if they could, and we have to fight them on
that.
And that's again, I think it's possible that different states will achieve different results.
There's something else, again, just to get back to the political philosophy part of it, there's something else about this movie that I think missed something entirely, which is, and I think this is something you would agree with, that regardless of what individuals might do, the republic endures. So if a president declares himself or herself to be in a third term and the rest of the country says, yeah, no, we're not doing that, they go and they reconstitute the United States government elsewhere, and they ignore the crazy person who says that they're president, right? This is, your thoughts about this, about the endurance of the republic over the long term. What do you think?
Well, I think that's right. I think and the genius of this country, thanks to James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and so on, is the states. Every the 50 states has the nucleus of its own government. It's its own government. So if the D.C. goes nuts, people in Texas can say, all right, look, we'll just have to do it here.
Yeah.
Or Massachusetts or California or Oregon. So each state governor has its own executive, and they have the beginnings of a police force and a National Guard, and they can say, listen, we will take care of the common defense and all these things right here in Montana.
Right. We have a certain level baseline of what's protected in the Constitution that everybody needs to adhere to. All people are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Here are those rights enumerated, and we know that there are unenumerated rights thanks to the Ninth Amendment. Not thanks to the Ninth Amendment, but just talked about it. I want to be really clear about this so that folks understand. I'm not saying that rights come from government or rights come from the Constitution. I know they don't. I know that they are natural rights and they exist. Be really clear about that. My point in the end is that that this is the difference between calling us the United States and these United States, right? And we lost something in that regard. Let me come back to this, the issue of competitive federalism, and sort of go. See, I lost my train of thought and all of that. Please go ahead.
I'll give you another example of a state that needs to do something different. Okay, and as an investment point, let's get back to investments.
Please.
The Howard Hughes Company, which long ago sold out of tech, it's now basically a real estate development company.
Okay.
In 2021, they spent $600 million to buy 50,000 acres of land west of Phoenix in Arizona, and they had high hopes to build housing developments in new cities and everything else. And they, to their shock and chagrin, the Democrats won the governorship in Arizona in 2022, and the new Democratic governor, who's something of a green, said, well, golly gosh, as we look at this development, we have to go back and study the Groundwater Act of 1980, which says you can't build anything unless you have 100 years of water ahead of you. And that flummoxed the Hughes Corporation. Again, you got to ask yourself.
Which if they were still in tech, Howard Hughes would have said, okay, then I'm going to build a desalinization plant in Southern California. Sorry, go ahead.
You're stealing my line.
Sorry, go ahead.
And so, the Greens.
I haven't read the book yet. But
how could anybody with a straight face say, I can predict the future 100 years from now?
Right.
No, nobody can.
Nobody can.
And among the solutions, and this is an idea that's been floating around in Arizona, is you can build a desal plant, just as you said. Now, the problem is Arizona is landlocked. And so the obvious place to get desalinated water from, and you can do it for about $5 billion, is California. But, of course, California won't desalinate its own water.
Sure.
They're sure as heck not going to let you pipe it through to Arizona. The Sierra Club would kill you on this. But fortunately for Arizona, the Sea of Cortez, part of the Baja Peninsula, is a mere 64 miles
There you go.
from the Arizona border. So they could make it. Arizona could make a deal
With Mexico.
with the state of Sonora and the narco terrorists and whoever else is there, and say, listen, we'll build a $5 billion plant, pipe it up to Arizona, and then I made the calculation. The value of residential real estate in Arizona is about $1.3 trillion.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, if they had abundant water,
Right.
everybody got their swimming pool back and their lawn and their fountain, the price of real estate would go up easily 10%.
Listen, let's not forget it would certainly calm the issue of sea level rise. Right? I mean, if the seas are supposedly rising, pulling more water out of the oceans would certainly be a way of abating that. I would think.
Exactly. I mean, there's lots of solutions.
Yes.
Once you start thinking about tech, for
Right.
example, about 11% of the land surface of the Earth is below sea level.
Oh yeah.
So if you wanted to, you could just pump water into below surface.
Sure.
In a good chunk of the Sahara Desert.
Yeah.
And you could have a new Mediterranean. That's not in the book. But the desalination that you touched on for Arizona is, again, you could never get California and New York to agree on some national plan for desalination. Right. A state on its own could.
Yes.
And that would be an example of, again, and if Arizona could do it, would Nevada do it? Would New Mexico do it?
And here's the interesting thing, right? Because, obviously we know that with the enviros, one of the issues they have with pipelines is that if they leak oil or natural gas, that's a problem. Not that I guess liquefied natural gas is liquefied. But if you're pumping water, for them, it then becomes some other justification of the disturbing species habitat. But, you get, let's say, the Koch Industries involved. They, built more pipeline than just about any other entity in America. And you're really talking about something here. But again,
3 million miles of pipeline in this country now. So every time you hear about the Dakota pipeline, they want to build an extra couple hundred miles of pipeline. It's on top of the 3 million miles, and we're still living, aren't we?
Yes.
And so, again, if you insist on letting California veto Arizona,
all right,
then you're never going to get it.
Right.
If you say, look, in return for California not vetoing Arizona, Arizona won't veto California.
Yes.
And now you're getting to a good live and let live that actually, see, on this polarization, you meant this Civil War movie, which I admit I haven't seen.
No, yeah.
It's how do you reduce polarization by turning problems into win-wins.
Right, especially in an environment in which, and this gets into something that happened over the week. I was at an event family event over the weekend, and I got to talking with the spouse of a cousin of mine about, where we are as a nation and this issue of polarization. And this comes into my thesis, which is that for the last 50 years, we don't have to talk about where this is coming from, but for the last 50 years, there are certain segments of our population that are undermining and undercutting who we are as a people, right? Is America the greatest nation on the face of the earth? Are we an exceptional nation? Are the principles of the American founding valid, or are they invalid because the founders were a bunch of slave-owning white men, privileged slave-owning white men? And so when you can't agree on who we are, this is the thesis, when you can't agree on who we are as a people, like where we came from as a people, I mean politically, I don't mean, physically, geographically, then how could we possibly agree on where we're going? How can we come to solutions and compromise? But here you're talking about a solution to that, which is enlightened self-interest. You do what's best for you, and I'll do what's best for me. And as we pursue, in Adam Smith or John Nash terms, as we pursue what's best for us and those around us, we all win.
Exactly. Let's keep in mind, blue states have some pretty good cards to play, of which the leading one is probably AI.
Yeah.
It's always sort of startling to conservatives to think, where is ChatGPT, OpenAI headquartered?
Right.
It's in San Francisco.
Yeah.
If the people with the IQs of 200 who have figured out ChatGPT choose to live in San Francisco today, that tells you a lot about who they are. And you don't have to think they're personally all that good, but you certainly have to respect the product.
Right.
And you certainly have to, when Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, says, as he did the other couple months ago, I need $7 trillion for chips for this. Again, who can look at AI and its prospects and say that $7 trillion for chips is too much? I
will tell you, I've done some wonderful things with ChatGPT, especially in terms of summer. I had someone once send me hundreds of pages of legal documents having to do with climate issues. It was just way too much. So I got ChatGPT to summarize them. And then I got them to summarize them again. And finally, I got a decent, readable summary in it. I tried to do that. I was attending an event, symposium, where I got 250 pages of briefings. And I don't know what happened to ChatGPT, but it was not able to summarize those things again, which was I don't know if they've dumbed it down or have the wrong edition. I don't know. They're
trying to upsell you to the paid.
Listen, I would pay for it too. Anyway, I'm looking at some of these other ones. But that's exactly it, right? I mean, these states do have things. We've had conversations with Chuck DeVore and David Dunmoyer from the Texas Public Policy Foundation, both of them refugees from California to Texas. That's the example, right? They both spent time in California. They didn't like the political climate there, so they decided to lend their talents to what's going on in Texas.
And Truman Capote
Yeah.
was born in Alabama.
Yeah.
And Halston was born in Indiana. And Tom Ford was born in Iowa. And they wanted to go to New York.
Sure.
Okay, so people, that's the joy of this country, is that different. I had a conversation one time with the well-known science fiction writer Larry Niven.
Okay.
And I said to him, okay, Larry, you've been writing sci-fi for 30 years, and you're a really smart guy. What have you learned? And I was expecting to say something about space or lasers or something, or time travel. And he said, people just as smart as you think completely different.
Right.
And that again is human nature.
Sure.
The natural law protects them and their opinion just as much as it protects us and our opinion. And so it's actually better if they live in Massachusetts and we live in Texas or Virginia or wherever. It's better because then they can do their thing and we can do our thing. And that's as George Washington said, be under your own fig tree and enjoy the vine.
Sure.
I mean, it's just that's again what Madison and Jefferson bequeathed to us in the Constitution, in the 10th Amendment, that says the states will be the main arbiters. And again, I wrote about this the other day, that back in 1798, in a crisis with the Adams administration, James Madison went to the Virginia legislature and said that the state of Virginia has the right to, quote, interpose itself to the federal government. James Madison. And then Thomas Jefferson went to Kentucky and said that Kentucky has the right to, quote, nullify the federal government. At the time, Thomas Jefferson was vice president of the United States. He was vice president to Adams.
Yeah.
And they were talking about interposition and nullification and the states really being prior to the federal government. You should keep that in mind. All of a sudden, all these regulations that so infuriate people, including all this transgender stuff and so on, all of a sudden just go out the window and say, look, we don't want those things. And here in Florida or North Carolina or Alaska, we can say, we don't want the education department. We don't want the Food and Drug Administration. Yeah. I think that's coming. And sooner the better. And from an investment point of view, it could, the quicker it did happen, the quicker you'd start to see new industries rising in different states, even if the federal government didn't like them.
I want to come back to the book in a second because I want to talk about my own inability to see trends and to pick things. I tend to pick badly. But I want to come back to what you're, in talking about the founders, because you style yourself and have styled yourself as a Hamiltonian. And obviously Hamilton very much in vogue in the last few years because of the musical. One of my problems with the musical is that it doesn't talk about one of my problems, and with the left generally nowadays, is that they tend to distill these events and the people behind them into psychodrama. What was motivating them? What was Hamilton being motivated by being an orphan and sort of having a chip on his shoulder? Well, also, he was a principled gentleman who believed what he believed. Talk about Hamiltonianism as contrasted with Jeffersonianism, if there is a contrast.
Well, there is a contrast.
Yeah.
Hamilton, was most of all driven by patriotism of this country, and as he wrote in the Report on Manufacturers to President Washington in 1791, we, the Americans, nearly lost the American Revolution because we couldn't make muskets and ships and barrels and things like that. And so the lack of manufacturing is what distinguishes a country that wins a revolution versus one that loses a revolution. So a lot of what Hamilton and the Hamiltonian tradition is about national defense, which everybody ought to support. In the book, I recall the work of the early 20th century author Herbert Croly, who wrote a book called The Promise of American Life, where he said that American history can be seen as the oscillation, the toggling between the Jeffersonian tradition and the Hamiltonian tradition. Hamilton, again, is structure and finance and sometimes tariffs.
Yeah.
Jefferson is liberty and freedom, all that stuff. And again, in American history, there have been times of sort of the Jeffersonians were ascendant, before the Civil War, the Hamiltonians were ascendant, during the 20th century and so on, back and forth. And my point is they're both right.
Right.
Is that if you want railroads, you have to create what I call in the book a Hamiltonian framework. You have to have a legal system that says property rights, the U.S. Army will defend the railroads. It just becomes, and that's how you get 300,000 miles of railroads.
Well, it gets to what you're talking about in terms of your view, and I think maybe it's a misnomer, big government libertarianism, right? This is bound up in this, isn't it?
Well, I meant it's kind of a joke.
Of course, yes.
And the thing is, again, Nevada flourishes because it is an enterprise zone for gambling within the United States. There have been plenty of rich city-states in the past that we don't, we used to talk about Hong Kong all the time as a beacon of prosperity. We don't talk about Hong Kong anymore. You know why? Because the Chinese communists took it over.
Exactly.
So you need a plan for your rich city-state to be defended against the Huns or the Nazis or the whoever's. And so Nevada managed that by being inside the Union, and so it's been defended against the Russians or the Japanese or the Utahns or whoever. and Hong Kong and Goa and Venice and Macau were not defended. So there's a political art here that involves a framework that includes, again, back to what the big government is good for, national defense.
So it's funny because today I happen to be on in prepping and sort of looking at the summary of your book and some other things. I was reminded of I tend to have a very bad track record in picking products, and I bring it up because I was searching through some of my tweets. And I came across a tweet. Emily Zanotti, who was with the Wall Street Journal for some time, has been a contributor to a number of different outlets. She had tweeted out a piece of advice from Warren Buffett about investing, which was you find products that you like and you invest in the companies that put out those products, which is, again, a very libertarian way of looking at things. To which I responded that I have a very bad track record of picking things that don't last. In the example I used at the time was a Dell smartphone. Dell Computers made a smartphone very, very briefly. I loved it. Apparently, nobody else in America did. I think it only sold about 700 phones. That's not an under-exaggeration. So in my case, what do I just pick the opposite of what I like, or in terms of investing, or what do I do?
You may have the trend. The trend that is your friend, Andrew, is podcasting.
Yes.
So you stick with podcasting.
Sure. Yes. Yes.
It's funny about Buffett. One of the authors that I kind of rely on as sort of a guidance to me was Peter Lynch. Who had a wonderful run at Fidelity for 20 years in the late 20th century, and a lot of his investment advice was boiled down to noticing if your friends' spouses, he's being a little sexist here, if your friends' spouses all say they like legs pantyhose, then chances are it's a good investment.
Sure.
And if he's made the same comments of Dunkin' Donuts are always crowded, then that's a good investment. So you can learn a lot just by observing. And again, on this wokeness and Disney and so on, half the country likes woke.
Right.
They support woke. And when half the country doesn't, okay. So therefore you have to figure that if a company aspires to be a national brand, is going to have a heck of a problem, isn't it? Because half the country is blue and half the country is red. So you're going to have to. You can make a judgment as an investor. Can these guys make themselves purple?
Sure. Yes.
Nobody objects to what they're doing.
Well, and that's the thing. I had a conversation with somebody in advertising and marketing about the overstatement that a lot of folks in advertising and marketing forget that there is a half of America that believes that woke DEI is garbage and shouldn't be kowtowed to, and they seem to be picking one or the other.
And so therefore, will Black Rifle Coffee get anywhere versus Disney versus Starbucks?
Yeah.
We'll see. Yeah. That's the kind of question that investors need to be pondering. Both Starbucks and Black Rifle Coffee are publicly traded.
Right.
And will Angel Studios make a dent on Disney or rest of Hollywood. Another
Or
example,
just make a dent. Period. Yes.
Another example is BlackRock.
Yeah.
BlackRock is the biggest investment house in the world, and it became Blue Rock, didn't it? So as BlackRock becomes Blue Rock, and now states like Texas and West Virginia are yanking their pension funds from BlackRock, and it's still an enormous company, but as you see Carl Icahn and Ken Griffin leaving for Florida, and you see Evergreen Investments moving to Texas, are we seeing? I just speculate on this in the book, a Red Rock, a Wall Street Southwest something, and maybe we are. And if you think that's the case, it's not necessarily you have to even pick the investment. You just have to say, gosh, I want to buy real estate around there.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Listen, let's shift gears before we close things out because we're running short on time here. A segment I like to do with folks, I was going to do a podcast called Outside Interest, focused exclusively on what folks who are in the politics policy world, what they do when they're not doing this stuff. So when you're not writing and you're not doing TV appearances, writing books, writing columns, what are you and your lovely wife up to? What do you guys do?
Well, there's more books and podcasts and to be read and stuff. I mean, I'm very consumed on what I've been doing this book last year. I really tried to take everything that you and I have talked about over the last 30 years and put it into the book.
It is, and the name of the book one more time?
The Secret of Directional Investing, Making Money Amidst the Red-Blue Rumble. The
Red-Blue Rumble. And we hope the Red-Blue Rumble is going to come to an end at some point.
Well, become synthesized into a red-blue, into a win-win for both sides. AI plus energy plus carbon capture equals a happy solution.
Before I let you go, right? I mean, in the end, America is an aspirational concept in order to form a more perfect union. Now, perfection, and certainly as it was defined then, may be defined differently now, but this is part of the transformational process, isn't it?
Well, the Rumble. Exactly. I mean, look, we're now, in a way that didn't seem even plausible 10 or 15 years ago, we can really think it's pretty likely somebody's going to be on the moon or Mars in 10 or 15 years. And that opens up a whole new universe of economics, investments. There's a chapter in the book on space and also political science. What's going to be the legal status of the moon?
Yes.
If Elon Musk is on it, or the U.S. or the Chinese, or all three of us, or who knows what it's going to be. And, there's money in all this.
I think as I learned from The Martian, it's supposed to be like open seas. It's supposed to be, like maritime law is supposed to prevail, from what I understand.
Maybe.
But who knows? You're right.
The Chinese get a vote on that.
Right. Yes. And certainly, yes, if the Chinese get there. I mean, there was this, the NASA administrator was testifying earlier this week and apparently doesn't understand that the dark side of the moon is not always dark, but it's apparently changes. Jim, where do folks find the book?
They find it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble and so on. It's, again, The Secret of Directional Investing, Making Money Amidst the Red-Blue Rumble. It's published May 28th, but the great thing about Amazon and online ordering is you can order it now.
Order it early, order it often, order it for your friends and family members. And again, available on all of those platforms in the same way that we are available there. Jim Pinkerton, thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew.
Appreciate that. That was, of course, Jim Pinkerton. Go and check out his book. This has been yet another episode of The Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I am your host, Andrew Langer. As I've said, if you're watching us right now on YouTube, check us out on all major podcast platforms. If you're listening to us on those platforms, take a look at us on YouTube, subscribe, leave a like, leave a review, and let everybody know about it. As I said, I'm Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.